This is the video that goes over the purchase agreement. I'm not going to promise that it is the most riveting 28 minutes of your life, but it is important. Once you have an accepted contract or accepted agreement, it is a legally binding contract that everyone has to abide by. So be sure to watch it. Maybe watch the inspection section twice. Let me know what questions you have. I'm happy to go over any of it line by line. This is the Indiana Purchase Agreement form that is used by all realtors in the state of Indiana. What's important here are your names and that it matches how your lender has your name. So if you used a middle initial, we need to put that middle initial here, or the full middle name, or however you want to give it to your lender. Just remember that you are going to be signing a bunch of mortgage documents at closing. So if you're the King of England and you have 5 or 6 names, that's going to be a lot of signing. Section B describes the property. You'll see the street address and the legal address, and then it states that the purchase is of that piece of property along with any existing permanent improvements. That's anything that's permanently attached. We kind of use the rule of thumb that if you have to use a tool to remove it, then it's considered permanently attached. We also specify here the appliances that we want left behind, or if there's anything that we want the seller to take with them that they were perhaps intending on leaving behind, like maybe a playset in the yard, or that you don't want the washer and dryer left behind. And this is just an additional note that says now is the time to make sure you are comfortable with square footage if that's a concern for you, what the homeowner association offers if that's a concern for you. Now is the time to make sure you're comfortable with everything that's included in this purchase. Section C is noting the price you are offering. And of course, that's going to be negotiable once the original offer is made. We may go back and forth a few times on price and other terms of the offer. But this section talks about more than price. Throughout the contract, you'll see that we are creating contingencies to protect you. Contingencies say that if certain things don't happen, then you as the buyer don't have to proceed with the purchase, or you as the buyer have options on what you do at that point in time. So this is where one of the first contingencies pops up, creating an appraisal contingency. It says if you choose to have an appraisal and your lender is going to require one, if you're purchasing for cash, you don't have to have an appraisal. That's up to you. But if you get an appraisal and the property does not appraise at the purchase price or higher, then you have the option of canceling the purchase and walking away. Or we may try to renegotiate the price a little bit. You may just choose to move forward too if you want the house regardless. And this happens sometimes when there are multiple offers and the price gets driven up a little bit. Section D is about the earnest money. That's a bit of money that you put down to show the seller that you have some investment in the property and that you're not just going to disappear, fall off the face of the earth, and not buy the house, that you intend to uphold your end of the contractual agreement. We can talk individually about what an appropriate amount is, but that has to be deposited with the listing agent within a certain number of days of the offer being accepted. It goes into their escrow account, and they're not earning interest off of it or playing the ponies with it or anything like that. It just sits there until closing, and then it comes back to you as a credit towards your closing costs or your down payment. Number 2 here just continues the discussion on earnest money, talking specifically about what happens if the transaction doesn't close and how the earnest money is handled. In section E, we are telling the seller how you are planning on paying for the purchase. If you're paying cash, we'll check that first box and then specify if you're doing an appraisal. But most people are checking box number 2, stating that you are getting a mortgage. We're also creating a financing contingency that says if at the end of the day you can't get this kind of mortgage with the terms that we've specified, then you can terminate the transaction. Now, it doesn't mean that you are tied to those terms like the interest rate, just that if you can't get this kind of mortgage, you could kill the deal. This protects you like this. If interest rates shoot up before you can lock in, this would be your out. In this example, we're saying that you're going to get a loan for 90% of the purchase price, so we're going to put 10% down. But if all of a sudden you realize that you can put 15 or 20% down, that's fine. You can do that. It's just creating sort of a worst case scenario to protect you since financing isn't ever locked in until you have an accepted offer. Numbers 3, 4, and 5 are rarely used alternate forms of payment like a contract sale. Section F also has to do with financing, and it's basically reassuring the seller that you're not going to wait until the day before closing and then say, oh, I need to go get a mortgage today. That we are going to do our due diligence to stay on track with the timelines, and we're going to do that by applying for the mortgage right away and getting approval usually within 30 days. Section G is new this year. If you need to ask the seller to help cover any of your loan closing costs, G1 is where we would note that and the amount or percentage of the purchase price. I typically prefer putting an amount in there. If you ask for more than you need, then you've lost out on some money in negotiations. So you'll want to get an amount from your lender if you need closing cost assistance. It's not required, and it does kind of muddy up the offer a little bit when you ask for closing cost assistance. It comes off of the seller's bottom line, so we need to give it some thought before asking. Also, if we're asking the seller to cover the buyer agent commission, we do that here in G2. Section H specifies several things about closing. First is the date of closing, and in this example, it's February 14th, 2025. This is the date that everyone is agreeing to close. If it needs to extend beyond that for any reason, for example, the loan is taking longer or something comes up and someone's out of town, both parties must agree to extend that closing date. Otherwise, the transaction can be terminated. So, this is a really important date to get on your calendar as soon as we have an accepted offer. Please check your calendar to make sure you're available on the proposed closing date before we submit the offer. Number two talks about who is paying for the closing fee. Now, this is different than the closing costs associated with your mortgage. This is just the fee that the title company charges to perform the closing, handle the monies, and make sure the title is free and clear. We typically share that equally between the buyer and the seller because both parties are using that service. It's a few $100s to each side. And again, what's important to understand is this is not your closing costs associated with getting a mortgage. Number three is a contingency if you have to sell another home before purchasing this new home. If there's no other home to sell first, then we would check the box that is checked here, is not contingent upon closing another transaction. Numbers 4 and 5 have to do with wiring funds at closing. If you are to bring more than $10,000 to closing, whether that's down payment or down payment plus closing costs, if that total is more than $10,000, then state law requires those funds to be wired to the title company. Don't worry, we'll give you all that information on how to do that when we get closer to closing. It's nothing you need to do right now, just something you would need to do a day or two prior to closing. Number 5 is talking about wire fraud that has happened in the past. So we are just warning people, hey, you want to make sure that when we give you wiring instructions, you call the title company, double check the info. Again, this is stuff that's going to happen 30 to 45 days from now, so this is just a heads up. Section I is about possession. So when you, the buyer, get possession of the property. Sometimes it's at closing, and sometimes it's within a certain number of days 3 days, 5 days, 7 days after closing. That's a negotiable item, and sometimes we offer a little bit of possession after closing if that's appealing to the seller, like it gives them time to get moved. It can certainly help an offer rise to the top if there are multiple offers. Number 2 here talks about the maintenance of the property, which is that the seller is required to maintain the property in its present condition. So if something breaks or something gets damaged between now and the time you take possession, not closing, but possession, the seller should fix it. You have the right to expect the property to be in about the same condition as it is now when you take possession. Obviously, when you move furniture out of there, there's going to be dust bunnies and things like that. There is no legal requirement in terms of cleaning. So I always tell my clients just to expect to give the house a good cleaning before you move in. The sellers are required, however, to remove all debris and any personal property prior to possession. Number 3 talks about casualty loss, which is if something bigger happens, like a tornado comes through and takes off the roof, then you have the right to either terminate the agreement or you may choose to close the transaction, but working with the seller's insurance company to make sure the repairs get made to your satisfaction. And number 4 is utilities are the seller's responsibility through the date of possession. Again, not closing, but possession. And number 5 is about home heating fuel. So if you're purchasing a property that has a propane tank and there is propane left in the tank, this is where we determine how that is handled. Section J only applies if you are buying an investment property or property that is currently rented with tenants in a lease. So let me know if that's the case and we will talk about it. Section K talks about if you're going to ask the seller to provide a survey of the property or if you want to do a survey prior to closing. Typically, surveys are waived unless it's a large piece of property or we have concerns about a neighboring fence or building that is encroaching over the property line of the property that you're intending to buy. So if you have concerns about a survey, let's talk about it and see if it makes sense or if there are other ways to satisfy your concerns. Section L creates a contingency that if the property ends up being in a floodplain that you are currently unaware of, you could cancel the agreement if it requires flood insurance. We probably already know if it's in a floodplain, but just in case something weird comes up, it's an extra layer of protection for you. Section M discloses whether you are using the property as an owner occupied property or as an investment property, and if you need some time to get some sort of zoning approval. And Section N creates a contingency on your ability to get homeowners insurance on the property. Section O is one of several that strongly encourages you to seek expert opinions if you have any concerns about environmental contaminants like lead-based paint, radon, mold, anything like that. We just want you to seek out the experts who can answer your questions and not rely on anyone like myself who is not an expert in any of those environmental fields. Okay, let's talk inspections. Section P is all about inspections, and there's quite a bit here, so we're going to split it up into a couple of chunks. The first section is telling the seller that you're going to do an inspection, and it creates the inspection contingency. There are three options here. The first one is waiving the inspection. I don't recommend that except in very specific cases, and it's not something that is typically done in our area, thank goodness. The second option is that you reserve the right to have independent inspections. This is the box we typically check. This part also specifies that you will hire the home inspector at your expense because you want the home inspector working for you, not working for the seller. I'll help give you references for that when the time comes if you need them. And this part also specifies that the seller agrees to have all utilities on for inspections. The third option is that the property is sold as is. This means you have the right to do inspections, but then after inspection, your options are that you either move forward with the purchase or you walk away. There is no negotiating on repairs or renegotiating the price. You buy it or you don't. Not a super appealing option to sellers, in my opinion. So most people end up checking box 2 that you reserve the right to have independent inspections. This next section talks about the inspection response. So A is about the timeline. We put in a number of days, it's usually 14 or 15, to get the inspection done and formulate a written response to the seller. My job is to keep track of timelines, so I will make sure that you are doing what you need to be doing when you need to be doing it. I keep track of all those timelines, so don't let it get you stressed out. Letter B here is all of the things that you are reserving the right to have inspected, and that's the heating and the cooling, and the attic and the roof and the walls and the outlets and the septic, if there's a septic, and the crawl space. I mean, it's pretty much everything. Letter C says that if we need a contractor to come out and look at something that came up on the inspection report, we have the right to ask for a few additional days to do that if we can't get the contractor out within the original 14 or 15-day timeline. And then section D is stating that if you do not make a response to inspections, if you don't ask the seller to make any repairs or any kind of written response to the seller within that timeline, that 14, 15 days, then you accept the property and you move forward to closing with no repairs. So it's really important that we stick to our timelines here and understand what those timelines are. Again, that's my responsibility, so don't stress too much about that. We'll make sure that we stay on top of all of it. More inspection stuff. Section E is my favorite section about inspections because I think it's the most misunderstood. I'm not sure why that makes it my favorite, but anyways, maybe play this one twice for me, okay? Thanks. All right, so letter E, if a defect is found during an inspection, then your obligation as a buyer is to either decide to still move forward with the purchase or provide the inspection report and give the seller a chance to remedy the defect to your satisfaction. You may just be like, I don't think it's a big deal. I'm not worried about it. And you move forward with the purchase. That happens a lot. You're not going to ask for every single thing identified in an inspection because you're buying a used house most of the time, and there will be things that aren't perfect. But if there is something that you are worried about, you have to show the seller what the defect is in the report and give the seller an opportunity to remedy the defect. That means you can't just walk away at that point. You have to give the seller a chance to remedy it first. The next part of this is that once you make those requests to the seller on how you'd like a defect remedied, if the seller is unable or unwilling to remedy the defect to your satisfaction, that's when you can walk away. So it's not until you give them a chance. Now, this is really important, the next item, G, because it defines what a defect is. A defect is defined as a health and safety hazard or if not repaired, would shorten the lifespan of the home. A health and safety hazard could be like a carbon monoxide leak or something with the wiring in the electric panel that could cause an overload. The second part to that definition of a defect is something that, if not repaired, is going to cause the home to become uninhabitable sooner than it should. So think about like a hole in the roof where water is coming in and damaging the wood, or a crack in the foundation. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking for. A hole in a window screen probably doesn't meet that definition of a major defect. But again, a hole in a roof, a foundation issue, an electrical issue that's a safety hazard, those are all things that meet that definition of a defect. Now, here on letter H, if the sellers have previously disclosed something on their seller's disclosure, and we'll get to that document here in just a minute, then that is something you are not able to ask for in an inspection response because you made the offer with the knowledge that something was not functioning or something was a problem. And the last letter I is just one of those hold harmless statements that I'm not a contractor and you should always consult professionals about inspection issues. Section Q indicates whether you are asking the seller to provide you with a home warranty. If we've not had that conversation about what a home warranty is, hit me up and we can talk about it. There are pros and cons to it, so it may be something we need to think about if it makes sense for you and how it might fit into your offer package. Section R. In the state of Indiana, there are a couple disclosures that are typically required. As the buyer, you'll review and sign these with the offer packet. I've included blank copies here. This first one is the residential seller's disclosure. It is not intended to substitute for an inspection. It is simply the seller stating what is and isn't included and if there are any known defects. But you have to remember that sellers are not contractors like you and I are not contractors, and most homeowners are not up on the roof or in their crawl space looking at it with a contractor's eye. So just because there are no defects noted, it doesn't mean that there aren't any things with the home that need to be addressed. It just means that the seller is not aware of any. If they are aware of something, then you need to make that offer with that knowledge in mind because you can't come back later and ask the seller to fix something that has been disclosed up front. If a home was built prior to 1978, then there would also be a lead-based paint disclosure, which would just be the seller stating if they've ever had the home tested for lead-based paint, which most of the time they have not. But that's only for homes built prior to 1978. Section S is all things title, which is probably not something that is front of mind for you, but it is important, so let's guide you through it. We are asking the seller to provide a title insurance policy. That is ensuring that the property is free and clear of any back taxes or any liens or anyone else staking any kind of claim to it. If there were an issue down the road, 3, 5, 10 years from now, and you still own the property, then you could file a claim with that insurance company and they would cover costs to help get it taken care of. I will say that in nearly 1,000 transactions I've closed, I've had one client come close to having to file a title insurance claim, but we were able to get that resolved. So it doesn't typically come up, but if it did, you would want that insurance because you don't want to lose the property or lose all the money you have put into the property. We typically ask the seller to provide that owner's title insurance policy, which covers you for up to the entire purchase price or value of the property. If you are getting a mortgage, there is a second title insurance policy, which is called the lender's title insurance policy. It provides the lender some insurance in case they were to be out of pocket because they also have a financial stake in that property being free and clear. And then we also decide here if the buyer or the seller select the title insurance company who manages the funds for closing. Again, that's usually something that happens behind the scenes. Most people don't have super strong feelings about title companies, but if you do have a wish to work with a specific title company, let us know and we can probably make that happen. Section T talks about how property taxes are going to be handled during the sale. It is a very, very confusing thing. So you will not be tested on this. Maybe just kind of know that you understood it at one point in time and then you can let it leave your head. That is okay. There are a few options out there on how property taxes are handled, but in our market, I would say that 999 times out of 1,000, we are checking the box number 2, which is that any unpaid taxes you are either being given a credit for or they are getting paid at closing. Confusing, right? I've got a chart on the next slide that we'll go over that explains property taxes a little bit better. Every state is a little bit different in how property taxes are paid and how they are handled at closing. In Indiana, we pay our property taxes in arrears, which means that the year passes and then the property tax bill comes due the following year. I say it's like eating at Applebee's where you eat and then you pay, as opposed to eating at McDonald's where you pay and then you eat. So we have the year pass, we eat, and then the bill comes due, we pay. So the property tax bills that are due in 2025 actually cover the year 2024. So where it gets tricky is because in 2024 you didn't own the home. So you shouldn't have to pay the property tax bill that covers a period of time when you didn't own the home. It would be like paying someone else's water bill from a month before you own the home. This chart shows how we work out credits at closing so that you aren't paying a property tax bill for a time period when you did not own the home. Any period of time that the bill hasn't come due yet, but covers a time period when the seller owned the home, the seller is going to give you a credit for that estimated amount so that you are whole and not paying a bill that isn't yours. Because we don't trust the seller to come back 6 months from now and pay that bill, right? So they're just going to give you the money for that and you'll pay it when it comes due. They may be good people, but that's a risk you don't want to take, them coming back 6 months or 12 months from now. If you want to talk more about that and get specific on what numbers look like for your specific situation, we can have that conversation. Just let me know. Section U discusses prorations and special assessments. If there are any assessments from the homeowner association or anything that's going to be prorated, this section lays out how that proration calculation is done and who is responsible for which portion of the proration or the assessment. You should know before making the offer if there are any assessments pending or in place, and this is mostly for homeowner associations and condos. Section V is the time is of the essence clause. This is a standard clause in most contracts. It says all contracts have time periods and deadlines within them, and we all agree to stick to them. What's important to understand here is that the seller and the buyer during negotiations have the right to withdraw any offer or counteroffer prior to written acceptance and delivery of that offer or counteroffer. What that means is that you make an offer and you give the seller a day or so to think about the offer. You can withdraw that at any time until they respond back with an acceptance. You can back out an hour later and be like, nope, I've changed my mind. But likewise, if the seller counters back to you, so you make an offer and then the seller gives you a counter offer and says, oh, you can take a couple of days to think about it, they can withdraw that counter offer at any time before you accept it, especially if they get another offer that's better than yours. They can go work with that other offer and you are left out in the cold. They can say, hey, we are rescinding that counter offer that you are thinking about and ending negotiations with you. We're going to work with another buyer. Let me know if you want me to explain that more because it's important. I've had a couple of buyers years ago not really understand that, even though they watched the purchase agreement video, and they got burned because they thought, oh, I've got 2 days to think about how I want to respond to this counter offer. And meanwhile, someone else comes along, makes an offer, and the seller withdrew the counter offer that my buyers were thinking about and left the buyers out in the cold. Moral of the story, make decisions as quickly as you're comfortable making them. I'm not going to pressure you, but we do need to try to proceed through negotiations as quickly as we can. Section W, if you are purchasing a property that is in a homeowner association, then this section talks about when you would receive homeowner association documents and other HOA information and how much time you would have to review them before moving forward. Section X is the attorney fee section. It states that if this contract has to be enforced in a court of law, that the losing party would pay the winning party's attorney fees. And Section Y goes over federal fair housing laws, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. It also mentions that I am not able to provide any kind of personal letter to the seller, trying to tug at the seller's heartstrings to accept your offer, as this can lead to fair housing violations. This last section is additional provisions. It covers a lot of odds and ends, important stuff, but odds and ends that don't really fit anywhere else. So you can read it through and feel free to ask me any questions you have. I'm just going to hit a few highlights. There is information in here about meth lab registry and sex offender registries if you have concerns about that. and how to check those out. It also says that we all agree to electronic signatures being acceptable and that documents can be delivered via email rather than just the originals. More highlights. Number 8, this contract will be enforced by state of Indiana laws. Number 10, this contract supersedes any oral agreements that may have been discussed with the seller or any notes in the MLS. It needs to be in the contract. Number 11, all rights, duties, and obligations of the seller shall survive, which means, as an example, if the sellers have agreed to do a repair and it doesn't get done properly, or you find out after closing it wasn't done, the seller still has the obligation to do that repair. Just because you sign closing documents, it doesn't free the seller from the things they had agreed to do. And number 12 is stating that I may refer people to you. I will give you suggestions for home inspectors or lenders or insurance companies, title companies. I don't get kickbacks from any of those. I don't make anything off of those. I am just giving you referrals based on my experience and knowing who will provide you the best service, but you are free to use whoever you want. And the last part of additional provisions just acknowledges that you've received a copy of the purchase agreement once we have it signed, that no money is due other than earnest money until closing, that you agree to receive communication via phone, mail, email, text message, fax, if anyone still has a fax machine, and that you do not have a real estate license. All right, we are almost there. I hope you're still with me. Further conditions is an area where we can put in anything specific to this transaction that doesn't really fit anywhere else. For example, sometimes if there are multiple offers on a property, we might put in language in further conditions stating that we're not going to be super picky on inspections so that your offer gets more attention. I once had to negotiate some Michael Jordan posters into a deal, and that went in here, but then the lender didn't like it because lenders don't like to think they're putting a mortgage on Michael Jordan posters, so we had to take it out. Usually this area will be blank. This section is another opportunity to encourage you to consult professionals. Say you have legal questions or need tax advice, consult the professionals in that field. It is also acknowledging if this is or is not a limited agency transaction, meaning how many realtors are involved. Do you have your own representation or are you and the seller using the same realtor to represent you both? This is where we put how long we are giving the seller to respond to our offer. And then the legal remedies section talks about if the buyer fails or refuses to close the transaction, that the seller does have legal recourse. If that were to happen, I would probably be encouraging you to seek legal counsel. And this is where you sign when you make the offer. I will probably be sending that to you for electronic signing through a program called Dotloop. Once the seller has reviewed the offer, they can either accept it, reject it, or they can counter it. So they would mark the applicable box and sign here. If they are countering, they would send over a separate document, counter offer, that outlines any parts of the offer that they are countering. And that's it. So please let me know if you have any questions and don't forget to watch that inspection section twice.